So, what was going on in the United States to pull people from Europe to here? What was going on here that made people want to come here? Well, there's always here in the United States the promise of a better way of life, more money. It's not always a realization, but that promise is always here. And one of the reasons that promise is here is because we do have things at this time that Europe didn't have, like a free public education for all children. Um, we had lower taxes. We had no forced army service, which most European countries forced you to serve at least 2 years in the army. And we had freedom guaranteed in our Constitution. First Constitution in the modern world to guarantee certain rights, freedom. So we did have a huge group of immigrants coming from these pictures from Ellis Island, New York City. For those immigrants, when they got to Ellis Island, they were often quarantined. You remember from your warm-up the other day. That means they were isolated to prevent diseases. If they were found out to have diseases, they were put on the next boat going back to the country they came from. This is a picture of New York City. You can see all the laundry hanging out on the lines there. And that picture of New York really gives a nice illustration of the amount of people who were moving into cities like New York and Boston. This created ghettos. And ghettos today mean exactly what you think they mean. But ghettos back then meant an area where one ethnic group or racial group dominated. So there would have been a Irish ghetto and a Jewish ghetto and a Scottish ghetto and a German ghetto. Didn't necessarily mean poverty. It meant this is where an ethnic group settled. The Chinese were brought in through the West Coast to help build the railroads, and they settled in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, and Seattle. They were discriminated against by unions and society. The Europeans who came here looked very similar to the rest of us. Of course, the Chinese that came here looked very different than the rest of us. It got so bad, this discrimination against Chinese, that in 1882 they passed something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that said that it was illegal to allow anybody from China to immigrate to the United States. That law wasn't even repealed until 1945, after World War II. Japanese were also discriminated against. They were brought here really because they were fantastic workers, especially on the farms, although here you see a group working on the railroad. San Francisco had to end its segregated school system in something called the Gilligan's Agreement, so they were also discriminated against. The Webb Alien Law, land law, had banned immigrant Asians from owning farmland because they were such good farmers, they were really putting to shame their white neighbors. Mexicans were brought in from into states like New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. They were recruited to work in the fields and to especially during the times when crops were harvested. Hundreds of thousands also left Mexico because there was a Mexican Revolution going on during this period, so they fled to America to get away from the violence. Cities is a different kind of story. Because of all the immigrants and because people were moving from the country to the city, the populations of cities rose from 28% of the country living in that urban area to 46%. Cities became so big that suburbs, like this would have been a suburb, Ben Davis or Wayne Township would have been a suburb of Indianapolis back then. And tenements popped up. These were cheap apartments designed to pack in as many people as possible. Usually no running water, usually no source of air conditioning for sure, usually no window, the only source of heat being a stove in the room. Unsanitary conditions for these tenements led to diseases and epidemics throughout big cities, and eventually fires would take whole city blocks out because these tenements were packed in so closely together. It also meant that because the tenement was an area where poor people lived, that you had these pockets of extremely high poverty in cities. The results of city growth? Well, cities became more powerful than countries, which means the politicians from cities became much more powerful than the politicians from rural or country areas. And political machines or bosses who ran cities, they controlled the government, they controlled the job market. They became very, very powerful during this era too. And that is the end.